Uh, Hello all. Great to see such a broad mix of companies joining us today for one of the most talked about topics of the century, GDPR. Before I hand over to our GDPR expert, Ian, I'll give a quick nod to FaceTime for the benefit of those less familiar with the initiative. This webinar is brought to you by FaceTime, which is a hub of resources designed to get exhibitors the best results out of their exhibiting investment. FaceTime offers everything from our popular exhibitor masterclass to YouTube videos to webinars and guides in its mission to support and prepare exhibitors for the show. You can take a look in more detail at www.facetime.org.uk. If you think there's something missing from the hub, we'd love to hear from you too. We're very open to ideas about what the next guide, webinar or masterclass session might be. Just pop us an email on hello@facetime.org.uk. So back to GDPR, which is what you're all here for today. Please feel free to ask questions along the way, or if you prefer to ask them at the end of the presentation, that's fine too. The recording will be available to all attendees shortly after this webinar, so don't worry about scribbling everything down. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ian.
Thank you, Carmen. First of all, I'd just like to say I am not a GDPR expert. I don't think anybody is because it's so new and we have no case law. But I've been working with this for some time and I can walk you through the key things that you need to be aware of and what you need to think about. So I've worked as an operations director and been involved with compliance with data protection for many years and done work in the public sector and private sector where we had to adhere to very strict rules. So I have some background in it, but as I said earlier, I'm not an expert and I'm also not a lawyer either. So what I'm telling you now is not legal advice. I do work with legal teams, and one of the interesting things even now is that there is some disagreement even amongst lawyers over things like the lawful basis for processing data. So the GDPR comes into force on the 25th of May this year, which is a Friday. We always like Fridays, and that's one that we may not like quite so much, but it's coming up. But we may, in the UK, we may not actually get the GDPR. We may, or it's more likely we're going to get something called the Data Protection Act 2018. There's a data protection bill that's currently going through Parliament, and it's expected to turn itself into law late April, early May. And that puts the GDPR into UK law. So after we exit from Europe, part of Brexit, we still follow the same rules. There are some extra things within the Data Protection Act, some derogations about how we're going to implement some of the rules and regulations, but you can think about it as it's just the GDPR in UK law. But when we talk about the GDPR, it doesn't exist just on its own. There are other rules and regulations that are going to apply alongside it. And the big one is to do with marketing. I'm just at the moment trying to get to the next slide, and it's hanging on my machine, so we should hopefully do that pretty soon. I'm just going to refresh my machine, which is locked up earlier on. The reason for that is the platform uses Flash to provide the slides, and my machine's locked down not to use Flash, so we might have to just work with that. I might actually ask Carmen now to actually walk through the slides with me. If they're there, Carmen, could you click on the next button, please?
Yep, sure.
Thank you.
Can you see that, Ian?
I can't see anything, I'm afraid, at the moment. My screen has gone completely blank. I'm just going to try and refresh the screen again. Hold on a few seconds while it sorts itself out, and then we can get back on it and do it again. So I'm afraid we still have a technical issue here.
Okay. Ian, if you prefer, you could always talk through your presentation. I mean, the slides will be available after the webinar, so people can sort of flick through them.
I think it's just come back to life again.
Okay.
So I'm just going to go backwards a bit. So apologies for that. It is a technical gremlin. So we were talking about the different regulations that will exist, and the big one is going to be on marketing, where we've got the Privacy Electronic Communications Regulation, PECA, which is currently in force alongside the Data Protection Act. And at some point that is going to get replaced by the e-privacy regulation. But that is not agreed at the moment, and they're still discussing that. So the PECA rules about marketing will still apply, and as we see as we get further on, that when you communicate with people before the event and afterwards, that's still going to apply. So we're just going to move now to the next slide. I'm hoping my screen will continue to work. And I'm making an assumption that the people on here, you've already made some progress to being ready for the 25th of May. The ICO have published a lot of really good documentation. Their 12 steps is at the heart of what you need to do. But if you haven't done anything and you've got some questions, there is a slide at the end of the things that you need to prioritise, because obviously we're running out of time, but you can still get on and do things. So I'm going to look at the stages in three ways. There's what you do before an event, before you get there, what you do while you're there, and afterwards. So before you actually get there, you need to decide what personal data you're going to collect and how it's going to be collected. So that's really the people that come to your stand, how you're going to get their information, and where is it going to be stored. You can do it on paper. You can get people to write their contact details on paper. If you have a sheet, you can get them to either fill in one sheet, or you can just get the email address on a list. Some people do it by having a tablet, and that's a really good way of doing it, so that you have your tablet at the stand. But if you do have the tablet, then make sure that it's encrypted. If you're using an iPad, then by default the encryption is turned on. But just be careful, if you're using a third-party app, then where does that actually store the data? Under the GDPR, you have to know where that data is stored, and it should be within the EU. If you're using some of the cloud sharing services, such as Dropbox or Box, it can store data outside of the EU, and that can present a problem. Things like Dropbox are covered by the Privacy Shield arrangements, but again, you need to check that. So if you're using a tablet, is a tablet going to be encrypted? Where you're going to store the data? Then the next thing down is the goldfish bowl. This: enter your personal details, put your business card into the whatever you're using to collect them. And I think some time ago people were saying, well, that's no longer going to be relevant under GDPR, but it doesn't actually change anything. One of the things for GDPR is it's not a completely new way of doing things. It's just refining what's already there and making sure that people are accountable for what they do. So if you're using a goldfish bowl to collect general business cards, fine. If you're using it to enter a prize draw, for example, we'll see later that you can still collect the cards and enter them into the prize draw, but you can't reuse them for another purpose without getting the person's permission or finding a way to move to another lawful basis of processing and make sure they're aware of what's happening. So you can still do that. It's not stopping you. And then the other way that I've seen people do it is an app on a phone, where you actually scan the badge directly into the app. And that's similar to the tablet that I described earlier. Where is that data going to be sitting? It's up to you, when you organise this and think about this, to work out where it's going. You can't turn around under the GDPR, under the accountability principle, and it's going to be very hard to say, well, I didn't know it's going to be stored in America or China or wherever it's going to be. You just need to make sure that that you know where it's going. So you need to do a bit of due diligence going forward. And there's another way of doing apps that I've seen where people actually have their own apps written, and that acts almost as a marketing tool that we'll see a bit later on. And the badge scanner as well, that you can still obviously use badge scanners, which generally come from the people organising the exhibition, but you need to check with them where's that information going to be stored. And you can take photos and videos on stand. That's a very usual thing to see, but you have to think about, is it going to capture people that just walking past a stand who wouldn't necessarily expect to be part of the video or of the camera? There's something called a DPIA, a Data Protection Impact Assessment, that you may have to consider to make sure that you've minimised the risks. But you can continue doing all of these things, but think about it before you start and how you're going to do it. So I'm now going to move to the next part of the slide.
Hi Ian, sorry, someone has asked a question about tablets.
Yes. I can't, my screen's locked up again, so if you can read the question to me, please.
Okay, they've asked, they said, you say tablets data should be stored in the EU. Is this a mandatory requirement?
It's not a mandatory requirement. You can store it anywhere where there is a sufficient level of control and security over it. If it's stored in the USA, there is the Privacy Shield arrangement, where if the company signed up to that, it's got a higher level of protection against it. So you need to do a bit of research and actually say, well, where's this data ending up? There are various rules and regulations that we can't really cover here, but it's recommended that you store it in the EU, but you don't have to. It's all down to risk. So can you move to the next slide, please, Carmen? Because again, I'm afraid my machine is locked up.
Okay, that's moved on to the next one.
Okay then. So I can't see that, which is not very good, is it? I'm just going to try and refresh my screen again. So this is how do you generate interest. So this is something else that you obviously be thinking of before you go to the exhibition. And a lot of people will obviously still be sending out emails to people, say, come and see us, we've got all these new things going on, come and talk to us. And it's back to email marketing. This is where the PECR, the PECA comes in, about how do you actually do that. If you've got an existing list of customers, there's no problem because you've got an existing relationship with them. You can send them emails. You've got legitimate interest as a basis for doing that. If you're planning to buy a third-party list of emails, then it becomes more problematic, as it's up to you to prove that there's a lawful basis for processing. You can't rely on the list provider saying, well, we've got their consent or they opted into this or that. You have to do a bit of due diligence over that. And I think it's going to be quite difficult going on to use third-party lists. Not impossible, but more of a risk to use them. So it's back to what are you going to do? But if you've got an existing relationship, that isn't going to be an issue. And the PCR obviously comes back into that. And the next item is to do with privacy notices. This is one of the changes that I've noticed quite a lot of difficulty in actually implementing with my clients is, as part of the privacy notice, you've got to give a lot more information than you currently give. And it's back to the idea of transparency that's at the heart of GDPR. If you tell people what you're doing with the data, then they're going to trust you to hold it and use it. So a privacy notice needs to be concise, transparent, intelligible and easily accessible, written in clear and plain language, and it notes within the regulation, particularly if addressed to a child. If you're on a stand, then this probably isn't going to be something that you can actually do for a child especially. But you've got to think about a privacy notice and actually have a copy with you. And what I'm seeing working with clients is that privacy notices are coming from lawyers who are really good at what they do, but they do have I think an issue in actually being concise and transparent, because they're used to dealing with lots of really technical terms, and you really need to get a copywriter or somebody involved. And there's very few good examples of privacy notices out there at the moment. So it is a challenge, but you need to have a privacy notice written before you actually get there, just in case somebody asks to see it. Somebody could be awkward and say, well, I've given you my business card, now what are your privacy details? Now, you don't really, in reality, have to tell them then and there what they are. It would be really good to do it, but this is my view, not a legal view, is if you tell them the next day, that's fine. So what do you need to be in your privacy notice? You've got to say what information is being collected, who's collecting it, who the data controller is, who's actually going to own the data, how's it collected, why is it being collected is one of the big things. People will say, well, what are you going to do with the data? Is it to send out marketing lists? Is it going to be for special offers, whatever it's going to be? How's it going to be used? Is it going to be shared with anybody? So all the things on that you can see in front of you should be in the privacy notice. And I think we have to wait until probably early May before we see some really good privacy notices coming out. I'm hoping that the lawyers are going to lead the way and turn what is really their legalese into something that's more intelligible and easier to understand. So that's beforehand. You're thinking about it, what you're going to do. So during the show, when you're actually there, brief the people that are going to be there and what they need to do, what is acceptable for them to do and what isn't acceptable. And one of the things that I've said before when I'm talking to exhibitors is I have been at places like Olympia and the Excel Centre, and people just wander over and try and scan my badge. Now, that really isn't on, especially under the GDPR, because you have no record of where that information is really coming from. It could cause you problems. So think about what you want people to do. To me, I don't really run exhibitions. It's just stay in the stand, be civil. Ask people, can I scan your badge? Can I take your details? And you'll be fine. Even if they want to know about the privacy notice, you'll have a copy there, so you can just bring it out. It just has to be. You haven't got to have lots of copies. I would just have one or two, maybe on A4, maybe laminated, so it's not so easy to lose or get damaged. But it will be a good idea to have your privacy notice there, just in case somebody asks. And back to video again. When you're setting up your video, just be careful where you're pointing the camera. Don't have it just putting into the aisles. Put it for people that are actually on the stand. That'd be my suggestion to avoid that issue. And then
another question here, Ian.
Okay.
If we are in the EU but the person is not in the EU, i.e. Saudi, does this apply?
That's a very good question. The GDPR applies to people that are in the EU, not citizens, but just in the EU. So under that argument, if you're running the exhibition in the EU, then I think they probably would be. If you're running it in Saudi or a country outside of the EU and you're not processing the data within the EU, then the GDPR doesn't apply. But I would bear in mind that there's more countries that are introducing regulations that maybe not be as complex as GDPR, but the intention over time will be that everybody will harmonise onto sort of a higher level. But the answer is, if you're running in the EU, then I would say that it's that person's in the union at that point, so it is their personal data. I hope that answers it, but we can come back to it later.
Sorry, there's another one.
Yes, please.
What constitutes an existing customer in terms of timescales? When would you have to have last completed a business transaction with them?
That's a very good question, and it's one of those it depends answers, I'm afraid. If your average time for repeat business is 2 years, then 2 years, I would say, is an existing customer, or maybe 2 years and 6 months in case they're going to come back again. But if your repeat business is, say, on an annual basis, and anything more than a year could be problematic. I was at an event on a panel with a lawyer who managed to argue that 9 years was a reasonable amount of time, but no one else agreed with him. I think he was taking it a bit too far. So just be realistic. Just go back over what's your typical order cycle. If it's a year, then I would say year to 15 months. But I would say don't get too hung up on emails. Try and use social media. If you've got a client that may have engaged with you several years ago, and you're linked to them on Twitter or LinkedIn, then just use those channels to get to them. I hope that helps. But we can come back to that again. That's a really good question. Keeping personal data secure. Obviously, you're collecting it. Make sure that your tablets people don't walk off with them. For one thing, you've got to replace it, but also they've got access to that personal data. If it's encrypted, it's very hard for them to get at it, but potentially they could do it. And also, paper records I've seen people just drop paper things on the floor. Just keep them safe, because really, it's at this point, if you've lost the information, then you've lost those potential leads. And goldfish bowl again, you may want to empty it and put it in a safe place every few hours. So just going to move on to the next one now.
Do we have time for another quick question?
We do have time while my screen refreshes.
Okay. So when asking for consent from visitors to an event, do you have to specify the different methods of follow-up communications, i.e. email, text, post, so they can select their preferred method? Or can the statement be all-encompassing to include all methods of communication?
I would say if you're asking for this before the event, you need to do it on an individual basis. If you're doing it at the event, if you're taking their contact details at the event, then don't rely on consent. Rely on legitimate interest to contact them. But just send one email. We come to that on the next slides. But try and avoid consent. The issue with consent is that consent has to be as easy to withdraw as it is to give. So you can end up in situations where people have to have easy ways to withdraw it, and then you lose all their, or you just lose that channel to communicate with them. So if you can rely on legitimate interest, then I would say look into that. But again, it's not a clear-cut yes or no answer. The AEO have got, I think, 4 different downloads on their website with FAQs about GDPR, and it does go into legitimate interest in some more detail.
Okay, great. Another one. I don't know if you've got to your next slide yet, so
I'll try
and squeeze this one in.
Yep.
Is corporate data treatment the same as personal data? Do we need to consider someone's corporate details as personal data?
If you can identify an individual, then you do. So if the email address is info@ or sales@ wherever the company is, that's fine, because you can't identify an individual from that. But if it's john.smith@, then that is still personal data that you're collecting and processing. But under the PECR, you can rely on legitimate interest if you've got an existing relationship with that. And if you look at the PECR, that there are more details about that. But really, it is the same. There isn't a differentiation. A person is a person. And in the GDPR, it describes what they're doing as a fundamental right of an individual. So it doesn't matter if they're corporate or not. And one of the other things that you can get caught out with is in the PECR, it does have a distinction between a sole trader or limited liability company and a public company. If you're a sole trader, they're treated the same as a member of the public. So you can't just rely on something like companyname.co.uk and assume that is actually a company name, or you can treat them as a company. And it's very difficult to actually work out, without spending a lot of money and time, what their status is. So I would say treat everybody on the same high level, work out the best way to approach them. So the final one on this slide is using public Wi-Fi. And public Wi-Fi is incredibly easy to hack. So if you go to some of the bigger events and they're setting up their own public Wi-Fi networks that you join, is it isn't very difficult to actually spoof that, I mimic that, and get people just to join up. So if you're using Wi-Fi to connect your tablet to your cloud service, just use something called a virtual private network. It's a piece of software that it puts a tunnel around the traffic so people can't see it. So that's another safety measure. So after the event, you've collected all this data, and you've got to continue to think about the security of that data as well. So it's up in the cloud, or it's on somebody's laptop, it's on somebody's tablet. Again, just make sure that it's secure, it doesn't get lost in transit. And follow-up emails. I have a lot of discussions about this, and we've touched on it already, you can use legitimate interest to contact somebody that's actually given you their details. If somebody has provided you with a business card or put their name down on a list with their email address, they're only going to do that if they're interested in some sort of follow-up conversations. So you can send them an email under legitimate interest to say, really good that you come onto our stand or you met with our sales team. Just to let you know, here's our privacy policy. It's always a good way to get that across, to show them that you're serious about privacy and their security. And then ask them if they want to know more details and get in touch. What you shouldn't do is just add them to your email list. Unless you've taken measures during collection of that personal data to say, by entering this, we will put you onto our emailing list, and they fully understand what that means, and it could be quite difficult to fully get them to understand that in a noisy environment like most exhibition halls are. So send them a single follow-up email to say, really good to meet you, under legitimate interest, and then you could have other information within that in your footer. Technically, if you've got a link in there to say sign up for my email alert, that actually becomes a marketing email and you need to have an unsubscribe link. But that probably isn't too difficult to do. But follow-up emails, you can still do them. You don't need consent. You use legitimate interest. But just send one. Don't keep sending it, because that will become a problem. The next thing is data retention and destruction. What happens if no one replies to the email? How long can you keep it for? And that is a decision that each company has to decide on their own. As part of the preparations for GDPR, you have to decide on your data retention policy. How long are you going to keep an email or a contact? And if they don't get in touch with you, are you going to delete it after 3 months or 4 months or 6 months? But you must make that decision as a company about what you think is reasonable and have a justified process behind that. It's very hard for me to say what's going on in different sectors. I work across lots of different sectors, and some of them have taken the view that it's going to be 3 months. One company I know said it's only going to be a week. I don't think a week is long enough, but they've decided they don't want to run that risk. So have a data retention policy in place. And by a policy, it just means you'll have a category called leads, and your retention policy could be 3 months after sending initial email. And after 3 months and a day, then you have to delete it. And by deletion, it means completely deleting it. So it's not just if you got it in 3 or 4 spreadsheets, which again I wouldn't recommend, then you've got to delete it out of all of them. So have a single place, have a CRM system. That's what they're there for. But don't just mark it as inactive. Just get rid of it completely, blank it out. And then what else can happen afterwards? Now, if people have been awkward, and I'm afraid some people will be awkward after the 25th of May, they could issue you with a subject access request. Now, this isn't new. It's in the current Data Protection Act, and all it is you have to give them all the information you hold about them. But under the new regulations, you have to give more information than you currently do. So this can be quite time-consuming. A lot of the information is actually in your data privacy policy, but have a simple policy about dealing with subject access requests. The ICO have got a policy up there for dealing with requests under the Data Protection Act. It does need some changes to make it work under GDPR, but the essence is the same. And there's other rights of individuals as well that they could start to exercise. There's rectification, which is updates. If they've changed their first or last name, then they can issue a request to you to update it. Erasure. Again, that could be problematic for some people. They just think that if you get a request to say erase my data, you have to do it. You don't. If you've got another lawful basis for processing that data, you can keep it. If you've just collected it from an event and they say erase it, then you really haven't got another lawful basis. But if it's an existing client and you need to retain their data if you're offering some sort of guarantee on a product, then you would erase it from the marketing list, but you wouldn't erase it from your list of items that are covered under products. And then restrict processing data portability. No time to go into them now, but there's some really good information on the ICO site about all of this. It is all up there. You do have to dig around a bit, but if you follow their links down, and we come to that in the slide at the end, you can see what you need to do. But just be ready for anybody that's doing that. We'll just go on to the next point now, which I think my machine is doing it. While it's refreshing, is there any more questions that have come in, Carwyn?
Yes, there are a number of questions.
Okay.
All right, next one. Is it possible to upload photos from our stand with visitors at the corporate social media?
You can do that if it's obvious to people that photos are being taken. Normally you would have a sign on the stand to say photos are being taken, and if you don't want your photo to be uploaded, don't come onto the stand. To try and get consent forms from everybody, that isn't workable. So I would generally think that the expectation is that if you go to an event, an exhibition, and you go onto a stand where there's videos of photography going on, that you could end up in one of those. Somebody could say that they don't want to be in there, so you might need a process to deal with that. But providing you have a sign on the stand somewhere to say that it's photography is taking place, you're probably going to be all right for that one.
Okay, great. Next one. What are the guidelines for collecting data from young people? Is there an age when we require parental consent?
Under the data protection bill that's going through, it's 13 in the UK. Depending which country you're in, there's different rules and regulations, which is really what the GDPR is supposed to be getting away from, but it hasn't. So it's 16 is a default. In the UK, it's going to be 13, and under the age of 13, you should seek I think the wording is along the guides of the guardian or parent's consent, but that's more aimed at if you're offering an online service. There is some guidelines the ICO have issued about children. If you refer back to them, that gives more information. So
okay.
just want to move on. Sorry,
okay.
what's the next question? What's the next question? I'll take that one.
There's another one. We send a quick email at the end of the day to say thanks, and then another one a few days later to do a proper follow-up. Is that okay? I
would say just the one, not the two. That would be my view. I can't think of a reason why how you could rely on legitimate interest to send more than one. I would just send the one. So if we move on to the next item, is dealing with the detecting data breaches. Now this is a standard part of the process for preparing for GDPR. You have to be ready to deal with any data breaches that come along. Hopefully there won't be any, but it's part of your preparations. And a data breach isn't just somebody making off with your data. That's a data loss. A data breach is the accidental or unlawful destruction loss. Also, I'm not going to say that, you can read it. So it's quite a few things. And that's what you have to be prepared for, and people in your company have to be prepared for as well. If the data breach happens, then what do you do? Again, there's lots of false news and rumours going around about this, but if you read it, it's quite clear that you have 72 hours after becoming aware of it to notify it to the ICO, assuming you're in the UK. If you're in France, it'd be CNIL, about this data breach, unless it's unlikely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. And what that means in proper language is that if you lose, for example, a laptop or a tablet and it's encrypted and it's got a decent level of encryption on it, then the likelihood of any impacts on anybody is going to be negligible. So you don't have to tell anybody. So by having all the correct preparations in place, you're okay. So it doesn't mean that you have to report absolutely everything to the ICO. You have to say, is it one person, is it 100 people, is it 1,000 people, and then look at what the risks are. And there are guidelines on the ICO site about that as well. We will have to wait until we've had a few cases to work out what the lowest limit is. But if something goes really badly wrong, hopefully it won't, but if there's lots of personal information gets leaked out, and again, this is highly unlikely if we're just collecting information at an exhibition, more likely if your customer database gets compromised and there's a high risk, it's likely to result in a high risk to an individual, you have to contact them individually as well about what you're doing. So avoid having any data breaches. That's my message there. So if you haven't started already, what do you do? Well, there isn't that much longer to go before the end of May, so you have to prioritise what you need to do. And my recommendations are: do your data mapping of personal data, identify what you have. Is it a CRM? I'm assuming it's going to be for most people. Is it going to be spreadsheets? Is it going to be on tablets? Is it going to be apps? Identify why you have it. What's the lawful basis for processing? It's either hopefully going to be contract because you've sold them something, so you have to have their address, for example, to send out the goods. It may be legitimate interest in some cases. If it's a lead that you've dealt with before and they want to keep coming back to you, it could be consent as well. In some cases, you do have to rely on consent, and also work out from the data mapping where you store it. And I can give you a story from something I did this week with a client where we had gone through the data mapping exercise and it all been signed off by senior management, and then we suddenly found out in the middle of a conversation that there was a third party had access to all this data because they provided a service to them. It's a valid service, but because of what they did, they had to have access to all the data. So you have to sort of expand about where you store it to think about, well, can a copy be taken by a third party? Because you have to work out if they could be impacted by a data breach as well and what they'd have to tell you. So data mapping, concentrate on the basics of what you have and why you have it. Put in basic physical and cyber security measures. By physical security measures, it literally is something like lock doors, lock things in desks. Cyber security, don't run old versions of operating systems, keep them patched up. And this applies especially to Apple at the moment. We're going through a very bad time and having to do quite a few patches. Make sure you apply these fixes, these patches as they come out. Everybody, Apple, Microsoft, Android, do that. Going back to data breaches, have a process for dealing with it. And also, the ICO have got a great tool out there. Assuming you're all data controllers who decide what to do with data, you can see the link on the screen, or just search for ICO GDPR tools. And this is a step-by-step guide of the things that you need to think about. If you're still stuck, the ICO have got a free SME helpline you can ring up. If you do ring them up, and I have rung it up before to clarify some things, they're not the sort of people that will tell you yes and no answers. They will probably say, well, why are you doing this? What's your lawful basis for processing? Because they generally can't give you hard and fast information about everything. It's back to a company to work out what's right for them. But the ICO tools and website, there's lots of stuff on there. So I've only got a couple more slides now. So this quote you can see in front of you is from a speech at the start of this month from the Information Commissioner, which basically tells you that after the 25th of May, they will start to take actions because you've had 2 years to prepare for it. But realistically, most organisations won't be 100% compliant. They still haven't actually told us what compliance means, but it's highly likely it's going to be down to what documentation you have in place and a record of all the things that you've done. As she said there, it's a long haul and preparations will be ongoing, but if you self-report a data breach, engage with us to resolve issues, can demonstrate effective accountability arrangements, that means documentation, you will find us to be fair. And the message they keep coming out with, and always come out with, is enforcement will be proportionate and, as now, a last resort. Somebody having a minor-ish issue isn't going to be hit with a €20 million fine, despite what some people may be telling you. So that's a really good statement. So have your accountability in place. Have a record of what you've done. And one of the questions I get asked is, well, what do you actually have to do for accountability? What do you need to document? I know this is a busy slide, but it's taken off of an ICO page. And a few months ago, they actually published a list of all the things they expect to be documented. If you go onto the ICO site and search for GDPR documentation, it will come up with a text version of that. So there's information for privacy notices at the top left. We've discussed that already. Records of consent. If you're relying on consent, you need a record of what they consented to and where. Contracts, where the personal data is located. And then top right, got Article 30. So it's just general documentation about the company. A lot of this comes out of data mapping, purpose of processing, a description, the types of individuals and categories of data. At the bottom of it, there's something to do with the data protection bill, where there's, if you're processing what's known as sensitive data, so it's things about health or criminal convictions, then you have to have extra rules. Now, I must say, I am ignoring that for the moment with my clients, because until the bill becomes the new act, it could be changes. But even if it doesn't change, most of this is very straightforward to do, providing you've already done your data processing activities. So that is the last slide.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. I don't know if you've still got a few minutes to hang around.
I have,
and
yes.
Work through the final questions.
I can stay here for another 10 minutes or so.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So next one, if we store data in an Amazon server in Ireland, for example, and their security gets bypassed, are we liable for the breach?
If you've enabled all the security settings on Amazon, and by default they're not all on, then it will be Amazon will be ultimately have the reputational damage. In that instance, what's recommended is if it's very sensitive data or there's a lot of it, that you put your own encryption measures around it. But it's got to be proportionate. You may not have to do very much, but the problem with the Amazon storage, it's really good, but it doesn't come with all the security settings enabled. You have to do that yourself. So just the fact that you're using Amazon or Microsoft Office 365, you have to do some work to make sure that all the relevant security measures are being used.
Okay, great, thank you. Can we store their details digitally but not add their email to marketing list? Is that okay?
That's fine. You can put them into a CRM to say that we collected it at whatever the exhibition is. And then your retention policy, if you've never contacted them, will say you will then delete them after 3 months or 6 months or whatever it's going to be. But yes, you can still do it, but make sure that that's secure.
Okay, great, thank you. If I am contacted by a potential client outside the EU, are my actions still governed by GDPR?
If you're within the EU, then basically it does, because you're processing data within the EU, so you're expected to follow those guidelines. Some large companies have gone down the route that the data never enters the EU and never gets processed by anybody in the EU to get around this. But as I said earlier, more countries are introducing regulations that are similar to the GDPR requirements. So at some point you will have to do that. But no, technically you don't. Provided it's kept outside the EU and you as a person inside the EU never sees it. If you've got an overseas office, then fine. If you do it within the EU, then I'm afraid, yes, it falls under the scope.
Okay, great. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions outstanding, but I think they are from organisers. So I'll get in touch with you
Okay.
after this, Ian, and hopefully you can answer those, and I can get back in touch with those
Yeah,
people.
no problem at all.
But thanks so much. I think that's a lot of food for thought and very insightful stuff for everyone. Good to see all the questions coming in. And the slides will be available after this webinar, so we'll be contacting you with those. And thanks again, Ian. Sorry again for the technical glitches at the beginning.
Yes, I do apologise. It's my computer's very secure and it doesn't like the platform, but I will try and turn a few more settings off next time. We got there in the end. Thank you for everybody for those really good questions as well.
Yes, thank you all. Cheers. Goodbye.